The Intimate Disaster of a King, Ferdinand VII, and the Curse of the Flesh. The somber summons. You are a royal physician in the Palace of Madrid, and the year is 1834. The air in the capital is thick with a nervous energy, a collective breath held by a nation uncertain of its future. The king is dead, but for you the work isn't finished. You've been summoned to the private chambers of the late Ferdinand VII for a task so bizarre, so unprecedented, that you find yourself questioning not only your medical oath, but your own sanity. The Queen Regent, Maria Cristina, stands before you, her face a mask of exhausted grief. Her eyes, red-rimmed from tears, hold a request that chills your blood. It must be preserved, she whispers, her voice barely audible. For science, for history, so that no one may doubt. You understand, though the words are vague. She is not speaking of his heart or his brain, the traditional relics of deceased monarchs. She is speaking of the secret. Your hands tremble as you approach the grand bed where Ferdinand's body lies. Even in death, the man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades seems to mock you from beyond the grave, his lips curled in a permanent, faint sneer. But it's not his face that draws your attention. It's what lies beneath the fine silk sheets. It is the thing that defined his reign as much as his cruelty, his paranoia, or his betrayals. It is the anatomical monstrosity that historians would whisper about for centuries, but never dare write in their official accounts. Ferdinand VII's member. His grotesquely oversized, bizarrely shaped endowment that was simultaneously the source of his deepest, most corrosive shame and his most twisted, defiant pride. As you begin the delicate and macabre preservation process, your mind wanders to the stories you've heard whispered in the palace corridors for years. Stories of custom-made cushions with strategically placed holes of the screams of teenage wives echoing through stone halls of desperate alchemical potions and frantic prayers to produce an heir against the cruel joke of nature. You realize with a sickening clarity that you are not just preserving flesh and blood. You are preserving the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself deformed, oversized, and ultimately destructive to everything it touched. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, take a moment. If you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient, intimate stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past, the curse of blood, and the genesis of a monster. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must first understand that he was born cursed. This was not a curse of witchcraft or divine wrath, but the far more tangible and poisonous legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. The Spanish Habsburgs, and later the Bourbons who succeeded them, had spent generations turning their family tree into a tangled, withered wreath. They married cousins to cousins' uncles to nieces, all in a desperate bid to consolidate power and keep the royal bloodline pure. The result was a genetic nightmare, a toxic brew that manifested in everything from the infamous Habsburg jaw and mental instability to epilepsy, hydrocephalus, and profound physical deformities. Ferdinand emerged from this toxic bloodline like a living, breathing embodiment of royal decay. Born at the austere and imposing El Escorial Palace on October 14, 1784, he was the product of King Charles IV and Maria Louisa of Parma, a couple whose own marriage was an arrangement between first cousins. The genetic lottery had been rigged from the start, and Ferdinand would pay the price in the most intimate and humiliating way possible. As he grew from a pale, watchful child into a gangly adolescent, it became terrifyingly clear that nature had played a particularly cruel joke on the future King of Spain. His member began developing in ways that defied all medical understanding. By his teenage years, court physicians were already whispering about the royal anomaly. It was not merely large, it was a biological aberration. Contemporary medical records hidden away in Vatican archives for centuries describe Ferdinand's endowment in clinical terms that nonetheless convey the horror of his condition. One physician wrote, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that intimate relations may prove challenging." Another was far more blunt, comparing the organ to a bizarre weapon. "The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin as sealing wax at its base, thick as a man's fist at its extremity, and long enough to serve as a walking stick." The psychological impact on young Ferdinand was devastating. In an era when male anatomy was judged by classical Greek standards, where smaller proportions were considered more refined and aristocratic, Ferdinand's massive member marked him as a grotesque freak of nature. The very thing that some modern men might envy became a source of profound, soul-eating shame for the future king. This was not a source of pride. It was his secret horror, the physical proof that the pure blood of the Bourbon had turned to poison. His childhood was a masterclass in dysfunction that would have broken a stronger man. Instead, it forged a tyrant. His father, Charles IV, was a weak-willed man who famously preferred hunting to the tedious business of ruling. His mother, Maria Luisa, was a woman of voracious appetites who openly flaunted her affair with Manuel de Godoy, who became Spain's de facto ruler. Young Ferdinand watched this daily humiliation, absorbing bitter lessons about power, betrayal, and the fundamental weakness of trust. But it was his physical abnormality that truly shaped his character. The court buzzed with whispers about the prince's condition. Servants giggled behind their hands. Courtiers made subtle, cruel jokes, and foreign diplomats reported back to their masters about the Spanish embarrassment. Ferdinand learned early that he was an object of mockery, that his most intimate self was a source of amusement for others. This constant simmering humiliation bred a deep, festering resentment that would later manifest in his sadistic treatment of Spain itself. He began to see mockery everywhere, in the respectful bows of his subjects, in the formal addresses of his tutors, in the arranged smiles of potential brides. His paranoia wasn't entirely unjustified. People were laughing at him, just not always for the reasons he imagined. His tutors noticed disturbing changes in his behavior as he entered adolescence. He became secretive, vindictive, and breathtakingly cruel to those who served him. Servants who displeased him would find themselves dismissed, or worse, anonymously accused of theft and thrown into prison. Ferdinand was learning to use the power of his position to compensate for the powerlessness he felt over his own body. One particular incident, recorded in the memoirs of a court chaplain, reveals the darkness growing in Ferdinand's soul. When a young page accidentally walked in on the prince changing clothes, Ferdinand didn't simply dismiss him. He had the boy flogged until he was unconscious, and his entire family exiled from Madrid. The message was brutally clear. No one could witness the prince's shame and remain unpunished. The Marital Nightmares, a chronicle of suffering. Act The Sacrifice of Maria Antonia. As Ferdinand reached marriageable age, the full extent of his anatomical challenge became clear. Dr. Francisco Flores, the king's personal doctor, left behind secret notes that provide a disturbing window into the medical reality. His Majesty's member, Flores wrote, presents a most unusual configuration. The base measures no more than the width of a man's thumb, yet it expands to a circumference that defies natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen, measuring near to 10 inches in its natural state and growing considerably larger when aroused. Most concerning is the peculiar curvature, and the presence of what appear to be additional tissue growths that serve no discernible biological function. The implications were obvious. Normal, intimate relations would be impossible without significant medical intervention and specialized equipment. The royal craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what they euphemistically called marital aids, specially designed pillows and supports that would in theory allow Ferdinand to function sexually without causing serious injury to his future wives. In 1802, that future wife arrived. She was his first cousin, Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily. The match was arranged when both were still teenagers, and Maria Antonia arrived in Madrid with romantic notions. She had heard he was called El Deseado, the desired one, by his supporters, and imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. The wedding was magnificent, a spectacle of royal splendor. Maria Antonia was beautiful, intelligent, and genuinely excited. Ferdinand in public seemed almost normal, charming, attentive, and appropriately romantic. But royal weddings end and wedding nights begin. The first sign of trouble came when Ferdinand's valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with an unusual request. Special preparations were needed for the royal bedchamber. Custom-made cushions were brought in along with bottles of oils and salves and various implements that seemed more medical than romantic. Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent, understood none of it. When Ferdinand entered the bridal chamber, her first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into hysterics. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, described the scene. Her Majesty began screaming as though she had seen the devil himself. She backed against the wall, pointing and crying, "Monster, monster," until we feared she had lost her reason entirely. What followed was less a romantic wedding night than a medical procedure. Physicians had to be called in to explain to the horrified princess what would be required. The custom cushions were arranged, the oils applied, and a process began that was more akin to surgery than lovemaking. The specially designed pillow was necessary to support Ferdinand's massive member, preventing it from injuring not only his wife but also himself. The process was so traumatic for Maria Antonia that she required laudanum to endure it. This became the ritualized nightmare of their marriage. Ferdinand, already paranoid, became even more twisted when faced with his wife's obvious revulsion. Maria Antonia developed what modern psychologists would recognize as severe sexual trauma, becoming addicted to laudanum to escape the horror of her duties. Twice, miraculously, Maria Antonia did become pregnant. The court rejoiced. But both pregnancies ended in devastating miscarriages. The first, in 1804, was attributed by physicians to the unusual stresses placed upon Her Majesty's delicate constitution. A coded admission that the sexual act itself was too violent for her body to sustain a pregnancy. The second miscarriage in 1805 was even more tragic, occurring near full term. Ferdinand's reaction revealed the true depths of his cruelty. He accused her of deliberately sabotaging the pregnancies, of harboring secret liberal sympathies that made her unwilling to provide a Catholic heir. These accusations destroyed what little remained of Maria Antonia's mental health. When she died in May 1807 at only 21, the official cause was fever. The truth was that she had died of despair, her body and mind destroyed by years of sexual trauma, drug addiction, and psychological abuse. Act 2. The Ghost of Maria. Isabel Ferdinand's mourning was perfunctory. His primary concern was finding a new wife. In 1816, after his restoration to the throne following Napoleon's defeat, he chose another cousin, Maria Isabel of Portugal. She was 19, and though her attendants were briefed on the special preparations, nothing could prepare her for the reality. The wedding night was a repeat of the first, a disaster of terror and pain. Servants reported finding blood-stained sheets and broken furniture, evidence of a coupling that resembled a medieval torture session. Isabel never recovered. Court observers noted that she developed a pronounced stutter and would flinch whenever Ferdinand entered a room. She began experiencing what physicians called hysterical episodes, but which we would now recognize as panic attacks and trauma responses. Ferdinand, whose paranoia had metastasized into a political psychosis, interpreted his wife's terror as a personal insult. His desperation to produce an heir led to a new level of horror. He invited foreign experts, German anatomists, and French physicians to observe his attempts at procreation, turning his marriage bed into a grotesque medical theater. Isabel, subjected to this parade of voyeuristic medical consultations, began to collapse. She stopped eating, lost dangerous amounts of weight, and developed a vacant 1,000-yard stare. The young queen had become a living ghost, haunting the halls of her prison. In 1818, after 2 years of this nightmare, Isabel escaped through death. She succumbed to what was termed nervous exhaustion. Her final words were reportedly a prayer of gratitude for her liberation. Ferdinand's reaction was again pure paranoia. He became convinced she had been murdered by enemies and ordered multiple autopsies terrorizing her ladies-in-waiting with accusations of conspiracy. Act 3. The resignation of Maria Josefa. The court now faced a difficult diplomatic challenge, finding a European princess willing to marry a king whose first 2 wives had died in such horrific circumstances. They eventually found Maria Josefa Amalia of Saxony, whose family's desperate financial situation made them willing to overlook Ferdinand's notorious reputation. Arriving in 1819, Maria Josefa was older and better prepared. She brought her own physician and approached the marriage not as a romance, but as a clinical challenge. For 10 years their marriage settled into a pattern of scheduled, medically supervised attempts at conception. Maria Josefa kept detailed records noting times, techniques, and outcomes with the precision of a research scientist. This clinical detachment seemed to frustrate Ferdinand even more than his previous wife's terror. He suspected she viewed him as a medical curiosity, secretly documenting his condition for foreign intelligence. Meanwhile, Spain continued to collapse. The American colonies won their independence. The treasury was empty, and the people starved while their king spent fortunes on sexual aids and foreign medical consultants. Then, in 1829, the impossible happened. Maria Josefa became pregnant. Ferdinand's reaction was euphoric paranoia. He placed the queen under what amounted to house arrest, surrounding her with guards and physicians. The pregnancy progressed until the 7th month when complications arose. Ferdinand, interfering with the medical treatment by insisting on consulting mystics and alchemists, created chaos. On May 18, 1829, Maria Josefa went into premature labor. The baby, a daughter, lived for only a few hours. Maria Josefa died 3 weeks later from infection and despair. Ferdinand, in his grief, refused to allow either body to be buried for nearly a week, demanding that his physicians attempt to revive them. The tyrant's mind. When paranoia becomes policy, Ferdinand's personal hell was not contained within the royal bedchamber. It spilled out and flooded the entire nation. His reign, particularly the period after his restoration in 1814, known as the ominous decade, was a direct projection of his internal state. A man who felt powerless over his own body became obsessed with exerting absolute power over his kingdom. A man consumed by shame and secrecy created a society governed by fear and surveillance. The connection is not merely metaphorical, it is direct. His sexual dysfunction metastasized into a political psychosis. He reinstated the Spanish Inquisition, not just to enforce religious dogma, but to investigate cases of sexual slander against the crown. A careless joke in a tavern about the king's difficulties in producing an heir could lead to imprisonment and torture. He created a climate of terror where private conversations were dangerous. His obsession with discovering plots mirrored his obsession with his wives' supposed infidelities and revulsion. The palace became a labyrinth of his paranoia. He ordered the construction of hidden passages so he could move about unseen. He had peepholes drilled into the walls of his wife's chambers, spending hours watching her like a demented voyeur. He employed a network of spies whose sole job was to monitor palace gossip. The food-tasting rituals became elaborate ceremonies of suspicion that could delay state dinners for hours. He trusted no one because he could not trust himself. This is the ultimate tragedy of Ferdinand's rule. His personal, physical problem became Spain's national, political problem. The resources of the state were diverted to serve his private obsessions. Cabinet meetings were postponed because the king was consulting with an alchemist about a new fertility potion. Foreign policy decisions were influenced by his belief that another nation's ambassador had looked at him mockingly. The decline of the Spanish Empire was accelerated not just by economic forces or revolutionary ideals, but by the fact that its king was too busy trying to manage his own deformed anatomy to govern effectively. The final deception and the grim legacy. Fate had one final cruel joke to play. In 1829, at 45, the king, who had destroyed 3 wives in his quest for an heir, entered a 4th marriage. His advisors, desperate for stability, had found Maria Cristina of Naples. What they didn't tell Ferdinand until the deal was done was that she was already pregnant by another man when she arrived in Madrid. The wedding was a farce. Maria Cristina was visibly pregnant, carrying a child that could not possibly be Ferdinand's. But the king, so broken and desperate, willingly accepted the deception. He embraced the lie, pretending the child was his, because the alternative, the admission of his ultimate failure, was unbearable. The birth of Isabella II in 1830 should have been a triumph, but it was a fiction built on a foundation of tragedy and deceit. Ferdinand's final years were spent in a haze of increasing paranoia. He continued his pathetic attempts at intimacy with Maria Cristina, hoping to produce a real heir. His physical health finally gave way, and he died in 1833, officially of gout, but in reality of a lifetime of physical, psychological, and spiritual exhaustion. The secret autopsy confirmed everything. The member, measuring an astounding 14 inches and grotesquely deformed, was a biological catastrophe. But it also revealed something more: pathetic evidence of scarring from decades of self-harm. Pathetic attempts at self-surgery with whatever crude tools he could find. He had been trying to fix himself, to carve normality out of a body that had betrayed him. The preserved organ, a testament to his life's tragedy, was sealed away in the Vatican archives, a secret too disturbing for public history. The lesson from the Chamber of Horrors. The story of Ferdinand VII is more than just a lurid historical curiosity. It is a profound and terrifying lesson on the nature of power. It demonstrates that power without wisdom is dangerous, but power combined with deep personal dysfunction is catastrophic. His reign is a case study in how individual psychological damage can metastasize into national trauma, how private shame can become public disaster. The most tragic victims were his wives, women sacrificed on the altar of his inadequacy. But the ultimate victim was Spain itself. The Spanish Empire, which had once dominated the world, was left fractured, bankrupt, and humiliated. Its decline accelerated by a king whose obsessions had blinded him to his duty. As that physician in 1834, finishing his grim task, you would look at the preserved organ in the jar and see more than a medical specimen. You would see a monument to the destructive power of shame, the corruption of unchecked authority, and the tragic waste of a nation's potential. Ferdinand VII had finally found peace in death, but he left behind a kingdom as damaged and dysfunctional as his own body, a nation that would struggle for generations to recover from the intimate disasters of his troubled reign.